Glory Cloud Podcast, episode 55. Stay tuned, everyone. We are back to Kingdom Prologue this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and I'm joined by our co-host, Charles Lee Irons. Welcome back, Lee.
Hello, Chris. It's great to be with you again.
Yes, glad to have you back. I will just briefly run through our regular housekeeping before we dive right into Kingdom Prologue this week. I hope that you regular listeners are going to our show notes page over at meredithkline.com/podcast and checking out the resources that we list there. Let's see. We very much appreciate the ratings that we're getting on iTunes and the subscriptions. Those are way up. We very much appreciate that. We continue to receive donations, and so for those of you who are donating, thank you so much. Your help is greatly appreciated. It means that we can continue to host the audio files on a month-to-month basis. If you have the means and you would like to donate, there is a donate button at meredithkline.com/podcast on the right-hand side of the page. And as always, you can email us at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com. But it seems like most of our interaction with our listeners takes place on the Meredith Kline Facebook page. And so you can go to that page and join as a member, and we'd love to interact with you there. We are picking up where we left off in Kingdom Prologue with, Section C, Glory Spirit Archetype. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we started a section entitled God the Alpha Author, and we're sort of in the middle of that section.
Right. So this is chapter 1 of a 5-chapter section dealing with creational covenant. Chapter 1 is on the Lord of the Covenant Kingdom, and so that chapter is divided into 2 parts: God the Alpha Author and God the Omega Consummator. And we're still under God the Alpha Author, and we're under section C of God the Alpha Author. And this section is dealing with the Glory Spirit, which is first revealed in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
And right after quoting that verse, he says, "Please see what I've written in images of the Spirit." And so we've already...
Yeah, basically chapter 1 of Images of the Spirit, which we covered last year, is behind a lot of what he says here. These few pages, 2 or 3 pages, are sort of a condensed version of chapter 1 of Images of the Spirit.
Okay. So it doesn't hurt to recap that material. But
so we'll give a brief summary of it here.
Okay. So Kline sees a parallel between Genesis 1 verse 2 and the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep and darkness, and Deuteronomy 32 verses 10 and 11, where the Spirit of God is described as hovering over Israel in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kline points out that the word for hovering is unique, and it's a rare word that's found nowhere else in the 5 books of Moses except in these 2 verses, Genesis 1:2 and Deuteronomy 32:11. So we can go ahead and read that, backing up to verse 10. In a desert land he found him being Israel, in a barren and howling waste. He shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. I'm quoting from the NIV there because the NIV uses the word hovers.
Okay.
And so that brings out the parallel with Genesis 1:2. But Kline's point is simply that we know that in Deuteronomy 32, when it talks about God hovering like an eagle over his people to carry them and bring them out of Egypt, that must be referring to the glory cloud. And so if the glory cloud is pictured as hovering over God's people in Deuteronomy 32, and this rare word for hovering is used only here in Genesis 1, then that suggests that the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2 is not the third person of the Trinity per se, although the third person of the Trinity is certainly behind it, but it's not the Spirit hovering, it's the Spirit manifesting himself in a theophany that's hovering.
Okay. We have another lexical parallel in the line "a barren and howling waste," don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's tohu, I think.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Which is parallel with Genesis. It's the same word used in Genesis 1. The earth was formless and void.
Okay. So much like this wilderness that Israel was in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So Kline would argue that the Exodus and bringing Israel out of Egypt is being pictured as a new creation.
Right. And it seems to be important what you were just bringing out, the visible manifestation. This isn't just, I don't know how else to characterize it, but and this is where he gets his idea of endoxation, that this is a very visible / physical manifestation in this world of the Spirit. And in the section that we will be dealing with in this episode, he takes up that same thing that I've read from Voss too, where the Spirit is almost the atmosphere of heaven, if you will. And that seems to be connected with what's going on here. Heaven has arrived.
Yeah, exactly. The glory spirit or the glory cloud is heaven in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And interestingly, Kline says something really fascinating here on page 30, at the very end, the very last sentence on that page. He says the usage in Genesis 1:2 of this word spirit is similar to the usage of the Spirit in the Old Testament in reference to the glory cloud. Although he says the Spirit here in Genesis 1:2 is probably best understood as the heavenly reality, the invisible cosmos-filling glory of the divine presence. So a minute ago you said the visible manifestation of the Spirit. Mm-hmm. Yes, in Deuteronomy 32 it is. And Israel saw it, the physical glory cloud.
Right.
It was visible. But here in Genesis 1:2, Kline wants to argue that it's actually the invisible archetype of that.
Okay.
And that the glory cloud that Israel saw was a localized manifestation of the invisible heavenly reality, which is still created. It's not the third person of the Godhead because it's related to creation, but it's invisible. It's basically heaven. It's the invisible heaven itself. It's the place where God dwells with his angels. So it's kind of an interesting thing here, the way Kline views, and this fits in with Kline's whole thing throughout Genesis 1 and 2, where he sees these two registers, the upper and the lower.
Right.
Even the word heaven itself is used with heaven, superscript 1, which is the invisible heaven, and then heaven superscript 2, which is the visible heaven or the sky. And the lower register heaven is like a visible replica of the invisible heaven above. And so he sees the same thing here with the Spirit, that the glory cloud has an invisible archetype and an earthly manifestation that is replicated based on that.
So this is heaven 1 that he's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Spirit, this would be Spirit 1.
Mm-hmm.
Genesis 1:2 is Spirit 1. So glory cloud 1.
Yeah. Although there's no creature to observe this anyway. Whereas in Deuteronomy 32, there is Israel to observe the visible manifestation. But
yeah. Well, we might say there's the angels. The angels are not specifically mentioned in Genesis 1, unless you think that they're the host in Genesis 2:1.
Good
all
point.
The host of them. But the angels were there.
Good point.
And they were created along with the creation of the invisible heavens.
So they would be part of that invisible reality.
Yeah.
Okay.
So why is Kline bringing this up? Why is he talking about the glory spirit? We're under this topic of God as the alpha author, meaning the creator.
Mm-hmm.
Why bring up the issue of the glory spirit under that topic?
Well, because Kline sees this glory spirit as being the blueprint, if you will, for creation, and not to jump the gun, but even consummation. I mean, he's the archetype for the entire thing. Yeah.
So basically, just to put it in simple terms, he views the glory spirit as a paradigm, and then the physical cosmos and man himself are both replicated after the pattern of the glory spirit. So that's why man is called the image of God, because he is a replica of the glory spirit. And then since the glory spirit is basically heaven, and it's basically the invisible sanctuary where God dwells, that means that the visible creation, the cosmos, is also a replica of heaven and is therefore also a temple for God to dwell in. And since man, as the image of God, is also a replica of the glory spirit, man is also a temple.
Wow.
And isn't that what we see when we turn to the New Testament, right? That
right.
We are God's temple. God is dwelling in his people. And he's refashioning us, recreating us into the image of God, according to the image of God.
That's right. And so as the glory spirit is this paradigm or this blueprint, we're encountering this for the first time at creation, but then along the line of history, we encounter this again in moments of recreation. So
that's why we see the glory cloud coming at these key moments, like at Mount Sinai. We see the glory cloud coming down upon the mountain and covering it for 6 days, and then there's the seventh day. It's all recreating the same. It's going back to the original creation model and showing us that in the work of redemption itself is an act of recreation in which God is replicating himself. The glory spirit is replicating himself, whether it's through Israel or, the physical tabernacle or temple, or God's people themselves being fashioned anew into the image of the glory spirit. And we even see the glory spirit present at key moments in the ministry and life of Christ, at his incarnation. The Spirit of God will overshadow you, the angel said to Mary.
Right.
And we see the same thing at the baptism of Jesus, the Spirit coming down in the form of a dove. The transfiguration of Jesus, a bright cloud overshadowed him. At Pentecost, we see tongues of fire. So all of these moments of redemptive recreation, they're all echoes of Genesis 1:2. They're all echoes of now the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters and replicating himself and fashioning and ordering and recreating.
Well, and then so another one of the themes involved in this is consummation, right? And so we're not only seeing the glory spirit involved in creation and acts of recreation, but also in acts of final judgment, even when it's penultimate and not the ultimate final judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we could say that all throughout redemptive history, when we see the glory spirit coming down and doing redemptive recreation, we just said, well, that's hearkening back to Genesis 1:2. Well, by the same token, they're also foreshadowing the ultimate consummation yet to come.
Right. Not simply looking back, but also looking forward.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, we're also getting at Sinai, right? With the fire and the smoke and the trembling of the mountain.
It's the day of the Lord, it's God coming in judgment.
That's right.
Consuming all that is evil and gathering his people to himself and making them into a glorious temple for God to dwell in. So the thing that's so great about this, and really, and I have to be honest with you, is last year, Chris, when you and I went through Images of the Spirit together, this aspect of Kline's thought really was driven home to me. And I just love this whole way of thinking, because it just shows how the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, from creation to redemption to consummation, is just shot through with eschatology. It's just all eschatology. That's all it's about, really,
Right.
And you just see all these moments of intrusion of that eschatological power, which is coming in as a, with the arrows going in both directions, both a reminder of the original creation, but also a foretaste of the new creation to come at the end. And that's what the whole story of the Bible is all about. It's driven by this eschatological engine that's just powering forward,
Mm-hmm.
It's just so great.
It's great and incredible in more than one way, I think. I suspect that we both had the experience in the kind of churches that we grew up in, with the tendency to view eschatology as what we affectionately referred to at Westminster Seminary, California, as pin the tail on redemption. That it was just relegated to the end of history.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this is exciting in the sense that, no, eschatology is there from Genesis 1:1, and it never stops being involved at any point that you open your Bible.
Right. And Kline was, completely in agreement with Voss, who said that eschatology is prior to soteriology.
Right. And Kline says that in different ways in the section that we're working through in this episode.
Yeah.
But what's also exciting to me is that Kline ties God's ontological being into this. God, the Alpha author, and God, the Omega consummator himself, is what ties all of this together.
Yes. Amen.
So
he's the kind of God who, when he begins things, he's going to finish them,
Right.
I just love that. I mean, Revelation 22:13, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And it's, like you said, it's rooted in God's nature. It's not just God had this neat plan, why don't we do this? This is who God is.
Mm-hmm. And it just gets so personal with the glory spirit making these appearances.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that God is sitting up in his heaven saying, okay, now do this and now do that. He's there. He's,
he comes down personally to deal with business,
right.
To get it done. Yeah.
To go back to our master builder analogy from last time, God's in there rolling up his sleeves.
Yeah.
Really personally involved in this.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. And it reminds me of, that cry in Isaiah, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down,
Mm-hmm.
That's the cry of God's people, that God himself would come down and engage and judge our enemies and redeem his people, and, look down from heaven and see, oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, Isaiah 64, verse 1, that the mountains might quake at your presence. And he does that. And he did it in Christ. I mean, the incarnation is a climactic moment of that, where God himself, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory.
The glory
it's all there.
Right.
Yeah.
And his name there, Emmanuel,
Mm-hmm.
he is, what kind of God is this? He's the with us God.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And then one last thing that Kline points out under this section before we move on to God, the Omega Consummator, is just, he simply points out that the fact that the glory spirit is there in Genesis 1, hovering over the surface of the waters, that's God's claim of ownership of creation. And so here Kline brings in those passages in the Psalms, like Psalm 24, verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And then he ties that into the idea of God's sovereign ownership is connected to the creation covenant, because sovereign ownership implies sovereignty. It implies the great king, and man in the creation is the vassal, right? Underneath God. And so that implies covenant lordship. And so then he ties this all back into the discussion that he had earlier, where he was trying to give all the pieces of evidence that there is a creation covenant. And he says this is another piece of evidence for that. The very fact that the glory spirit is there in Genesis 1:2 is another sign that there is a covenant at creation here. And that, of course, ties in with his view that whenever the glory cloud comes in the Old Testament, it's always like this idea, what he calls the witness pillar, and so it's a pillar of witness, which means it's a bearing witness to a covenant. It's always related to covenant transactions. And he has this idea of the oath stance, with the two legs, and then God is holding up his right arm in that oath stance. So the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud are like God's legs. And so this whole idea of the glory spirit is tied in with this idea of covenant making. So if we see the glory spirit in Genesis 1, then we see that God is not only stamping his claim of ownership over creation, but he's also entering into a covenant with creation.
Okay. And that, in terms of the text of Kingdom Prologue, brings us right into the section on God, the Omega Consummator.
Right.
Where that same paradigm or blueprint that the glory spirit ends up also being the pattern for the ultimate goal, the heavenly goal, the heavenly kingdom of God.
Right. And here he's focusing on the Sabbath. So Genesis 1:2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness is over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. That's marking the beginning point of the creation week. Then you have the 6 days of creation, and then you come to day 7, Genesis 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So Genesis 1:2 is God the Alpha author and the Spirit as the paradigm for that. And then Genesis 2, verses 1-3 is God the Omega Consummator, focusing on the end of the creation week, looking at the Sabbath as the sign that God is going to finish what he started, that he's going to bring the creation to a climax, to a consummation. And the Sabbath is the foretaste of that. It's the he calls it an earnest, like a down payment or something that you put down beforehand to guarantee the rest that's going to come. So God's resting on the seventh day is an earnest of the coming of the eternal Sabbath, which actually began then, but it's going to be brought to consummation at the end in the new creation. I like how Kline talks about God as a builder in this section here.
Mm-hmm.
He says God is like a builder. He's being pictured here like a workman going about his creative work, structuring the cosmos, creating the different spheres or realms, and then populating each sphere with its rulers and so on. And, even hanging the lamps in the ceiling, i.e. the luminaries, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And he's going around fashioning his cosmic house. And he's a divine architect, and he's doing this. And then at the end, he looks at it all, Genesis 1:31. He sees it all, and behold, it was very good. And then in the seventh day, he then takes up his rest within that cosmic house that he had just finished making. So you see how Kline is looking at the text and he's seeing things that are not on the surface. The text doesn't explicitly say that when God rested, that means that he took up residence within the cosmic temple. It doesn't explicitly say that, but he's looking at it and kind of, penetrating into the heart of what you see in the text. If you really think about the metaphor that's being pictured for you here, and then you can say, oh, now I get it. Now it starts to make sense.
Yes. And we do get some help from the New Testament texts, like Hebrews.
Yes.
But I agree. I mean, he's sensitive to what's happening in the narrative of the text in a way unlike any other biblical scholar I've ever known. Right.
But I mean, the way he does that, though, is looking at the text itself. He doesn't just look at things atomistically. He looks at Genesis 2:1-3 about the Sabbath, but he connects it to what we've seen in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 very clearly has those two triads. The first triad of days is creating the different spheres. The second triad of days is creating the rulers of each sphere. So it's clearly a construction of a cosmic house. Then you have verse 31, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. That implies judgment. That implies God looking down from his throne in heaven and looking at it all and making a judgment and saying it's very good. And so that brings to mind the idea of God being on his throne, a throne of judgment. That implies that he's a king, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we have that concept of king and we have the concept of cosmos being like a house or a temple for the king to dwell in, you see how you can very easily then get to the next step, which is therefore the Sabbath, which is the next thing. Next verse, chapter 2, verses 1-3. The Sabbath then must be a Sabbath that is related to that royal concept. And so it's God's enthronement in taking up his place within the cosmic palace.
Mm.
He says the royal nature of the rest follows from the royal nature of the work.
Oh, man. It's all tied together.
Yeah.
And we have to deconstruct it a little bit in order to talk about it.
Yeah.
But this is where he's going to end up talking about the law of the image son, because of the relationship between God's work and God's rest and the eschatology of that.
That's right. So one of the key things I was just showing how Kline is very deftly weaving together the different verses and strands in the text so that you can see the logic of how he gets to this idea that the Sabbath is a a royal enthronement where God is taking up his rest within the cosmic palace. But then in addition to just looking at the text itself and sort of discerning these thematic and symbolic strands in the text, Kline also goes to other parts of the Bible, especially places in the Old Testament that look back upon or have some kind of allusion to creation. So he's not just making this up. This isn't just his own, speculations where he's just reading into the text. He's actually saying that this is what the tapestry of biblical theology itself is getting at. So some key verses, one of the key ones would be Isaiah 66 verse 1, which is clearly an allusion back to Genesis 1. Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. So there you have the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. And then he says, what is the house that you would build for me? And what is the place of my rest? So now it's jumping forward to Israel's temple, and God is looking at that temple and saying, look, I don't need this earthly temple that you built because I have the whole creation. The heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. So what is the house that you would build for me? Although clearly that house is another replica of that cosmic temple, but it's just a, minuscule reflection of it. And it's really nothing in God's eyes, considering how vast God is. But then you have this phrase at the end, and what is the place of my rest? So here you have a very key verse that shows you explicitly that God's rest on the seventh day was a rest of taking his place in that cosmic temple. Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool.
Wow. Yeah.
So there you have, and this one verse, Isaiah 66 verse 1, ties all of these things together. It ties the creation cosmic temple. It ties that to the replica that was made by Solomon. And then it ties it to this idea of God's rest, which is also going to be, that has a forward eschatological significance as well. Another verse that Kline uses is 1 Chronicles 28 verse 2. This is David speaking. He says, I had it in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord and for the footstool of our God. And I made preparations for building. So here now we're talking just about the temple. David himself didn't get to build it. Solomon did, but David was preparing for it. He had it in his heart to build a house of rest.
House being temple or tabernacle language, right?
Right. Yeah.
Whereas I noticed from Isaiah 66 that word throne was used. And so, I mean, you could almost get a palace connotation from that. So we've got kingly imagery. We've got priestly temple imagery. It's just everything is already being woven and tied together right here in Genesis 1:2.
Yeah. Well, the idea of a palace is a good one because a human king has a palace. His throne is in the center of it, and that's where he reigns. But God, he has a palace too, but his palace is a temple.
That's right.
So the word house, then, it's a good word because it brings together both of these ideas of the throne of the king, but it combines it with the idea of the temple, so that when God is dwelling in the temple, he's also reigning on his throne within the house.
Okay. So that idea of enthronement above the Ark of the Covenant. Okay.
The Ark of the Covenant is the footstool or the throne where God rests. Another verse is Psalm 132, verses 8 and 14. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. And then a few verses later, this is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it.
Okay, so tying it in with the ark there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then he observes from Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, that the verbal root of the word menucha,
Mm-hmm.
which is rendered to rest, is used there instead of what we might expect to find for rest, which would be Shabbat or Sabbath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In Genesis 2:2, it says, on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done and rested on the seventh day. The word rested is Shabbat. But in Exodus 20, verse 11, when it says pretty much the same thing, it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested. That's the word nuach, which is where we get the word menucha, or rest. The noun menucha is rest. That noun rest is the noun that's used in all those verses in Isaiah 66:1, 1 Chronicles 28:2, and Psalm 132.
Okay.
So it just ties even more clearly this connection that when it talks about God's rest, when it talks about the temple as God's place of rest, and it uses the word menucha to say that it's God's rest, that is referring to God's Sabbath rest, because that's what Exodus 20 verse 11 says, that God rested, Yanach, on the seventh day.
Okay. So it, verbally ties it all together.
Yeah. He's trying to show that these Hebrew words are all connected. You can connect the dots from one to the other, just like Genesis 1:2 and Deuteronomy 32:11, using the word for hovering. He's doing the same thing here with this word to rest.
Okay.
So the point is that when God rested on the seventh day, that is a royal rest. It is God's enthronement. And we can see that because when God is enthroned above the Ark of the Covenant inside the Temple of Solomon, that is called God's rest.
Okay.
So the redemptive recreation of the Sabbath is clearly connected to the temple. And so it's not wrong then for Kline to see God taking up his rest and being enthroned within his cosmic palace on the seventh day of creation. It's not wrong for him to see that connection.
And then God's own rest that we've been discussing gets imaged in Israel's own experience, right? In their entrance into the promised land, and the language involved in their arrival and settling there is that same rest language.
Right. Deuteronomy 12, verse 9, you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. So Moses is talking to Israel on the verge of entering the land, and he refers to the land as the rest. That's the same word, menucha, that we've been seeing all throughout so far.
And I mean, I think especially of Hebrews chapter 4 and the discussion there about how Joshua was not able to give them ultimate rest.
Right.
It was a typological rest.
And Hebrews 4 is great because it connects the rest of entering the land with God's rest at creation.
Right.
Because he's basically commenting on Psalm 95, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. That is, they shall not enter the land, which is, quote, my rest. But then in the process of commenting on that psalm, the author of Hebrews then brings in Genesis 2.
For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way.
Yeah, somewhere. I remember scratching my head somewhere in the Old Testament. But that's Genesis 2, verse 2. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And then so he takes that word, God rested. Of course, he's doing it in Greek. But in Greek, the verb there is kata pao, and so it's cognate with the noun kata pausis, which is the noun used in Psalm 95. They shall not enter my rest. So he's tying those two things together. The author of Hebrews is a good biblical theologian.
Definitely.
And he's showing these connections between God's rest on the seventh day and the rest of Israel in the land. And he's saying, but really that rest in the land is not the real rest, because as you just said, Joshua did not really give them that rest. If Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on in Psalm 95. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Hebrews 4, 8 through 10.
And it reminds me of the point that he makes later in the book in chapter 11 that, look, Canaan was just a type. It wasn't the ultimate promised land.
Right.
Just like in this context that we're talking about, it's not the ultimate rest. In chapter 11, he's saying if it were, they could always go back.
Yeah.
But that's not what it's all about. We don't want to go back. We want to go to the ultimate promised land, the ultimate rest.
Yeah. So, we're moving forward to the eternal inheritance.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, Kline's argument here in tying the rest into the land is basically, what is Israel's resting in the land? Well, isn't it a royal resting in the land? Because they are a kingdom of priests. Isn't Israel's entrance into the land a royal rest where they occupy the land as their kingdom and they reign within the land as God's kings and priests in the land of Canaan? So if Israel's occupation of the land is a royal rest, and the same word menucha is used to refer to it. In fact, it's God's menucha, it's God's rest, and he's giving the people the opportunity to participate in it. Then that's another argument for saying that Genesis 2:2, when it talks about God resting on the seventh day, that is a royal resting, and that is therefore a divine enthronement in the cosmic palace.
Okay. Because of Israel's typological imaging of that in a way?
Well, it's more specific than that. It's the fact that God calls the inheritance that he's giving them, he calls it my rest. Right?
Mm-hmm.
In Hebrews 4, we saw that, quoting Psalm 95, they shall not enter my rest. And also Deuteronomy 12:9 doesn't use my, but it says, you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance that the Lord your God is giving you. And that's why they had to do certain practices like, the Jubilee Sabbath and things like that, and returning the land after every 7 years. The land had to go back. If any particular piece of the land had been lost because one of the families was sold into debt bondage, then the land had to revert back. because it's God's land. It's not theirs. It's God's gift of rest to his people. They are entering into God's rest. He's granting them rest in his land.
Right. It's not just rest like his. It is his rest that they're participating in. Okay. So let's talk about some of the imagery involved in the word itself, rest. Kline has both the last time that we talked about this and in this section talked about how it does not mean that God was breaking out in a sweat from his hard work of creating and needed to recharge his batteries.
Right.
And in the same way for Israel, it was not. I don't want to get ahead of us there, but so let's talk about what this rest does mean. If it doesn't mean that God needed a constitutional recharging.
Yeah, it just means that he's taking satisfaction and delight in his finished work.
Which we see in, for example, Genesis 1:31, looking at everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's like he's basking in the glory that is being reflected back to him. It's his glory being manifested in creation, and then he's basking in the reflection of that. Kline has a great quote on page 37 where he says, "Creation produced a new theater for the manifestation of God's eternal majesty." So it's not as though God didn't have glory before creation existed. He obviously did. He's all sufficient in his glory, and he doesn't need creation to have glory. But by creating the universe to be his cosmic palace, he's produced a new theater for the manifestation of his glory. It doesn't add to his glory. It's just a new theater for further manifesting it and reflecting it.
I think I've heard Mike Horton use the term extravagance in that regard. And I think that fits with what Kline is saying here too. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of this great section in the Westminster Confession. It's in chapter 4, I believe it is. No, it's in chapter 2 on God. It says, God, it's chapter 2, paragraph 2. God has all life, glory, goodness, blessedness in and of himself, and is alone in and unto himself, all sufficient, not standing in need of any creatures which he has made, nor deriving any glory from them, but only manifesting his own glory in, by, unto, and upon them.
Right. So, there's no sense of need.
Right.
But it's just, I appreciate the way Kline put it about it being a new theater, but it's like God saying, look what I can do. And I'm going to enjoy what I can do.
But Kline has such a high concept of God, He doesn't bring God down to a creaturely level as if God is somehow in need of the creation or somehow relative to the creation. And he brings in here this great verse from Paul in Romans 11:36, "For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." One of the great verses in the Bible that just, draws your mind from such a low creaturely contingent view of God to a God who's just absolute, a God who has aseity, who's not dependent upon creation, who's completely above creation, and who's not limited in any way by creation. And so he doesn't gain anything from creation as if he lacked something. He's simply further extravagantly, as you said, manifesting himself in creation.
Right.
It's great. It's just marvelous. Having such a high view of God is so great because then we have a God that can really be that anchor for us, that God who is truly God,
Right.
If we bring him down in any way to the level of the creature, then we're making him less than God. And then how could we worship him? How could we trust in him? How could we have confidence that, though the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, that yet from everlasting to everlasting, you are God.
Right.
I just love how Kline, there's some debates going on nowadays, about all these issues of like the immutability and impassibility and aseity and simplicity of God. And I just think Kline is on the right side of that, understanding who God really is.
Absolutely. Okay. So what about, the imagery of Sabbath as rest from battle?
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about how creation was not a battle for God. He was not creating with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. Mm-hmm. He simply spoke things into existence. And yet we do have battle imagery throughout the Bible. Mm-hmm. Maybe even intensified in the book of Revelation with dragons mm-hmm. and beasts and things like that. How does Sabbath rest fit into that?
Yeah, so Kline once again brings up this whole issue of the pagan myth. We talked about this a couple of episodes ago, or maybe it was the previous one. But he brings it up again on page 36. And he points out that there's this pagan myth where, and you see this in the Canaanite Baal cycle. You also see it in the Babylonian stories. In the Canaanite one, it's Baal defeating Yam, the sea monster. In the Babylonian one, it's Marduk defeating Tiamat. Mm-hmm. But in each case, after the god slays the chaos monster or the dragon, then he goes on to build a temple so that he can celebrate his victory and take residence within that temple. And that's part of his celebration of his victory over the enemy. And so Kline is saying, there's no battle here. There's no dragon that needs to be defeated. But we still see this basic idea that, at the beginning of Genesis 1, verse 2, the earth is formless and void. God brings order out of it. He creates the cosmos, and then he has finished building the temple, and then he takes up his residence within it to celebrate his quote-unquote victory. There's no need for real victory here, but still demonstrating his majesty and his sovereignty over creation.
Okay. And
then he ties this in to some things later on in the Bible. So, for example, you see the same pattern with King David. When did King David first begin to have this idea of, hey, maybe I should build a house for God? Well, it was after he had finished defeating all the Philistines. 2 Samuel 7, verse 1, when the king lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies round about, that's when he said, hey, maybe I should build a house for God. So you see that same pattern of defeating the enemies, then building the temple.
Okay.
And then you move forward into redemptive history to Christ. Same thing. He defeats the serpent at the cross. Then he ascends into heaven, sits down at God's right hand, and he's building the eschatological temple, the church. And then you fast forward to Revelation 19 to 22. The book of Revelation keeps talking about this battle, the great battle. And then when the battle is finally over, what do you see in Revelation 21? You see the cosmic eschatological temple.
Okay. So those
are just quickly, those are redemptive versions of it.
Mm-hmm.
But here we're looking at the original creation version, which doesn't have any idea of a genuine battle. There's no enemies yet at this point.
Right.
But we still see the same pattern of securing the throne and then being enthroned on the Sabbath.
Okay. And I think that all of that segues nicely into talking about Sabbath. And we've already mentioned this briefly, but Sabbath as the day of the Lord, mm-hmm. right? even if victory may not fit very well in terms of talking about creation, it still is his majesty. And, it is his reward in a sense for his work of creation. And so we still have that ultimate reward, still standing in the future as the ultimate goal. And that gets referred to or tied in with this theme of Sabbath as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's another element too, which is this idea of the judicial aspect, right? Mm-hmm. Because, we see it in Genesis 1:31. God looked at everything and he saw that it was very good. That's a judicial examining and looking at it and determining and then declaring that it's good. So that's a judicial act. But then we also have the Sabbath idea, which is a Sabbath enthronement. And so if you have enthronement, you have a king. And if you have a king, you have a judge. And so that implies the judicial aspect again. So Kline's point here, and he deals with this in more detail in Images of the Spirit, is that the day of the Lord that we see throughout the Bible, all in the Old Testament, it's talked about a lot, and then you get to the New Testament, and then at the very end of history, the day of the Lord actually began on the seventh day of creation, in Genesis 2, verse 2. That's the first day of the Lord. The Sabbath is the day of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And then throughout history, whenever you see the day of the Lord coming, these are intrusions of the day of the Lord into history in various moments of judicial activity.
Yeah, I love what he says at the bottom of page 37. The divine Sabbath, that seventh day of the enthroned Creator King, whose dawning marked the completion of creation history, is the heavenly reality that breaks into history in subsequent judicial episodes known as the Day of the Lord, and ultimately in the parousia day of the Lord Christ, which inaugurates the eternal participation of the entire new mankind in the divine Sabbath. But you have that idea of this end goal breaking into history ahead of time at various points. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So,
well, there's one last section here that I don't think we have time to get to today, called Sabbath and Consecration. The last 4 pages of this chapter. So we'll deal with that next time.
Okay.
But basically, this section here has been great because we've been focusing on the Sabbath and what does it mean, and showing how it is. Basically, it's showing that God is not only the originator, he's also the consummator of all things. And so everything is moving towards that eschatological Sabbath. So Genesis 1 and 2 it's fraught with excitement. It's setting up all these expectations and things are going to happen. There's yet more to come.
That's right. It's like there can't help but be drama because of what's being set up in Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay. Well, so let's pause here and we'll pick it back up with Sabbath and consecration next time.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Lee. I very much enjoyed that discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. It was good.
And I hope that our listeners have enjoyed this discussion as well. Please do read ahead for next week and join us at the Meredith Kline Facebook group to discuss these things, and we will see you next week.